This is a giant point of contention in timber framing, believe it or not. This is a square peg, this is a round peg. This is actually an octagon, which is another point of contention, but we're not going to get into that today. This is typically reserved for Japanese timber framing, and this one is for Western timber framing. I am here to tell you that making square pegs is easier than making round pegs. And I'd rather make square pegs and square holes than round pegs with round holes. So if you're confused as to how this works, here's a tenon, and there's the peg hole. You can see. That's how it works. So once this tenon goes into the mortise, this peg comes in through here, snakes its way around the mortise hole and the tenon hole, and then gets pulled in tight. And the way it does that is because this peg hole is actually offset from the dimension that's on the mortise. So I'll show you guys how to do that. And honestly guys, I'd rather be making square pegs all day long rather than making round pegs. Because do you know how you make round pegs? First, you have to make a square peg. So you make a square peg and then you knock down the corners. Let me take you through it. Alright guys, so this is the piece that we're going to be making our peg holes for. We have 1, 2, 3 mortises that we got to work with, and this is the tenon that slides into here. So you can see we still need to have a peg hole right here to hold this guy in tight. So these are 30mm tenons and 30mm mortises as well. I think they're about 2.5 inches wide. So if you were to use a round peg for this, you'd be taking up a whole lot of meat, whereas with Japanese timber framing, these peg holes are only 15mm square. Now something that's not going to change between Western and Japanese framing is going to be that your peg hole dimension is obviously measured from the shoulder. So in this case, we're going to be using a Japanese square. So this is a smaller Japanese square, this is a full-size Japanese square. And the first thing that you're going to notice about it is that they're very thin. They're also very flexible. They're made out of hardened stainless steel. Yeah, they're 15mm in thickness, both on the blade and the tongue, and that's on purpose. That's because most of their measurements are either 15mm or 30mm. And this sort of square is meant to be used with centerline layout. So if you're curious about how centerline layout works, it's the same layout method that Mr. Chickadee uses, and that's where I learned it at Mr. Chickadee's class. So I can obviously drop a link to that if you want. The spacing for these squares, for these mortises, are going to be 15mm from the shoulder. So from that shoulder, that shoulder, that shoulder, they're all going to be the exact same. So conveniently enough, I could just trace the width of my square by holding it flush there, 15mm, come back over here a little bit. Now, here's the important thing, is that you need to put your square and cover the line. You don't want to go onto the, right to the shoulder of the line. Your pencil has a thickness, so cover the line. So do that, and there's the back of it. Now you can go ahead and use this right here to get to the center of it, but because I can't see the center of it, I ended up using a small square that I made for myself. This is also 15mm, but has a cutout right in the center, so I can see that center line. So if you're curious, I've also marked the center of the joint, which is another feature of Japanese timber framing, and the center line layout is that you mark all the centers of every single joint. That way you can come in and easily mark the peg holes. So this line goes all the way around, and I can easily mark those peg hole centers. So I have a cutout right there, just lining it up. Okay, good. And there's the center of my peg hole. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for these other two as well. Now if you wanted to just use the square, what you'd have to do is come over here and measure 7.5mm over, right? Which is easier said than done. So I could do that, 7.5. Now mark a straight line. Now, since I have that 7.5, I just turn the square over. And there we go. Likewise over here. But you know what? I have this handy tool, so I'm going to go ahead and use it. Perfect. Now I need to mark the exact same thing on the opposite side. So this is something you need to make a decision on before you get started, obviously. These peg holes can be made before you hollow out the mortise or after the fact. One of the benefits of doing it before you hollow out the mortise is that you won't have this blowout. And then likewise, one of the benefits that you can have after you hollow out the mortise is that you can straighten it out and make it, you can kind of see the hole from both sides and correct any variation. So I personally like to do it this way because if I do have any problems I need to fix up with the shoulder or the mortise, I could do that ahead of time before I go to this final step. I look at this as kind of setting your trim, but you know, not everybody feels that way. And maybe you are concerned about the blowout on this interior side, but really no one's going to see that on the inside of the mortise. So it's up to you which one you decide to do. Okay, so to hollow it out, I'm using a 14mm wood owl auger, and this is only about the 6-inch version, so I don't really need a super long one. That's also one of the benefits of doing this after the mortise, is that you don't need a super long auger because you're only going halfway into the wood. So if I'm going to do this 6x6, or let's say I was doing an 8x8, I might want to get the longer wood owl auger, which is about 18 inches long. In this case, I only need to go halfway. Alright, so set the drill bit right in the center and make sure it's perfectly vertical. Okay, I'm going to do all of them. Now let's do it on the other side as well. So now we can see the holes all the way through, and now we could start to mortise this out with our chisel. Okay, so this is the first one that we're going to work on. So one of the things that we said was that if you do make your peg holes like this, then you're risking a lot of blowout. Well, you can easily remedy that by putting a sacrificial piece in there. Now when you chisel into that, now you have a surface where the material is not going to blow out as hard. So it'll still have some amount of tear out on the inside, but it's not that big of a deal. So for 15mm peg holes, we're going to use a 15mm chisel. This one's actually 14mm. This one's made by Mr. Chickadee, and as you can see, it's a striking chisel. You're going to want a pretty darn sharp chisel. So this one is straight out of the factory, as you would say. So I got it straight back from Mr. Chickadee, and it's ready to work. Unlike in a regular mortise, you're not gonna go to the long grain. You're gonna go to the end grain first. And so in this direction, the grain's like this. So I'm going right here, and literally all you're gonna do is go straight down. Okay. Now I can do the long grain. I can take this piece out. See, I got my chisel marks right there. And I can push all this material through and see if anything needs to be touched up. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now the real test is going to be when I take it out on the other side. So let's go ahead and flip this over. Okay, so the same exact thing. We're going to do the end grain first. So take this out to clean it up. And that looks pretty good. So I can still see a little bit of material on this back cheek right there. Now let's see if our peg fits. Look at that. Alright, that looks pretty good. So obviously this peg is a little bit undersized. Usually you're going to want a little bit more resistance than that. And usually your pegs are also out of a harder wood, so this is white oak, and that's what I make all my pegs out of. Okay, so that's super easy. Yeah, you got to do that for every single peg hole, but at the price of making these guys round, I think it's a totally worth it payoff. So this is what your peg hole should look like. I think that one of the benefits of making square pegs is that you can easily correct any deviation when you're using the auger. So the auger, once it chooses a path, it's going to go, and you have no say in what it's going to do, other than try to get it on the right track at the get-go. With square pegs, if your auger does deviate some, you can always kind of guide it afterward using the chisels and make it as straight as possible. That's the mortise, and this is what it should look like when you have your tenon in there. So you can see there's a faint trace of material on this side. That means that when I put my peg in there, let's put it this way, it doesn't go in quite as easily anymore. And the reason is because there's more material on this underside where the tenon was drawbored. So if I tap this in, well, now I'm going to have a really hard time getting this out. As you can see, now I can pull this all up simply by the tenon. So once I get that peg all the way through, it'll tighten up that tenon and pull this cheek really, really tight against this piece. And that is called draw boring. So of course with every mortise there's an associated tenon, and the tenons are a little bit different from the mortises. For one, the orientation of the grain is a little bit different, right? It's obviously perpendicular, so there's long grain going this way, so the end grain is going to be on this side and that side. Anyway, if you recall, we did 15 millimeters from the shoulder for the mortise, so we're going to start with that as a reference. So 15 millimeters is right there. But we need to draw bore it, which means that we need to have this hole offset from the other one. And the way I do it is I set it up over here, and I do about 3, maybe 3.5 millimeters in. And so if you're wondering why I'm doing millimeters, it's because these squares are in millimeters. So now I can set my square right there, and there's the bottom of it. Move the square up a little bit so I cover the line, and there's the top. Get my handy 3D printed centerline square and do the shoulders. Now the most critical here is going to be this shoulder and this shoulder. This one, I suggest that you don't get very close to it. If anything, leave the line. On this one, you can take the line entirely. And the reason for that is that this is going to be the shoulder that's going to pull this whole piece tight. So let's go ahead and start cutting that guy out. And go through. So this one you can go all the way through, you can go halfway, you know, kind of whatever you feel like doing. I'm showing you going halfway because that's what I feel like doing today. So now the exact same thing. We take our chisel, and we're going to start on this end grain right over here. So you can see my auger went a little bit past the line, and that's okay. This shoulder, in fact, this shoulder I could make this hole all the way up to here, and it wouldn't matter, because in fact I don't necessarily, I could oversize it in that direction and be perfectly fine. Whereas that's the opposite for the mortise. If I oversize it, it needs to be the other side for the mortise. And the reason is I need to have some opposition. I need to have that peg kind of going in a U sort of pattern, right? I need it to bend. So right here, put my chisel, and I'm going to go ahead and take the line. Okay, and then the same thing over here. I'm going to try to leave the line as much as possible on this one. Okay. And I'm not going all the way through because I have the other side to come back to it. Okay, I can clean it up from this side. And right here. So now let's go ahead and clean up these shoulders. And when I say oversize and undersize, I mean by like a millimeter, right? I don't mean take it all the way, you know, so don't overly exaggerate it, but you do want that peg to be nicely nestled in there. Okay, take all that debris out. And now we're going to have a nicely drawboard tenon. Let's see if our peg fits. Sure enough. And this is a very undersized peg, so it really shouldn't slide in that smoothly, but because I've taken off quite a bit, it works quite nicely. But anyway, there you go, all the way through. Alright guys, so this is a drawboard tenon, and if you're thinking about it, the only one that is drawboard that you need to have that offset with is the tenon, not your mortise. Although if you do have a mistake on a tenon, you can always go ahead and correct it on the associated mortise, but then you have to keep track of the pieces, and if you're just using kind of a interchangeable layout system, that's going to get a little bit complicated if you have to keep track of things. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy. Square pegs, really not that hard to get done. I prefer these to round pegs. Let me know what you guys think, whether round pegs is what you guys do, and if you've ever tried square pegs. Right, give it a try, give it a shot.